All right, so we're diving into these hybrid frameworks today.
Yeah.
Seems like it's all anyone's talking about in software testing these days.
Yeah, for sure.
So to get started here, can you just give us a quick overview of what a hybrid framework actually is?
So basically it's about combining the best parts of a bunch of different frameworks. So things like keyword-driven testing, data-driven, and modular testing.
Uh-huh.
And you combine them all together to get like a super-powered testing system.
Okay.
And then that lets you be flexible and use the best approach for, different testing scenarios.
Yeah, so instead of being stuck with like a one-size-fits-all framework, that might not work everywhere. You can kind of pick and choose.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, like let's say, for example, you're working on something with like a web application and an API.
Okay.
Then you can combine, Selenium for UI testing and Rest Assured for API testing.
Okay.
All within this like single framework.
Yeah.
And that gives you a ton more flexibility.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, let's say I'm a developer and, I've been using the same framework for years.
Sure.
And it's been working fine. Why should I even consider, switching to this new approach?
Yeah, that's a good question.
What are the real benefits here that would make it worth the effort to, switch?
So I think one of the biggest benefits is reusability.
Okay.
You can create like little modular components that you can just use over and over again in different tests.
Okay.
And that saves a ton of time and effort. And it also makes your testing a lot more consistent.
So you're not like constantly reinventing the wheel for every new test case you write.
Exactly. And then on top of that, it also makes it easier for different teams to work together.
Yeah.
Even if they don't have the same like technical skills.
Right.
Like maybe less technical testers can work on, defining keywords.
Right.
While the developers handle the actual code.
Okay, so we've got flexibility, reusability, better team collaboration.
Yep.
But what about test coverage? How does a hybrid framework help us make sure that we're thoroughly testing everything without, getting too complex?
Yeah. So hybrid frameworks let you do things like data-driven testing and custom workflows.
Okay.
So for example, imagine you're testing a login form.
Right.
You don't want to have to write a separate test for every single username and password combination.
Right. Of course.
So instead you define your test logic once and then you feed it with different data.
Oh.
And that can come from like a spreadsheet or database.
Yeah.
And that way you can cover way more scenarios with much less code.
Okay. That sounds really powerful.
Yeah.
Especially for complex applications.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I know we're going to get into how to actually build these things a little later.
Yeah.
But first, can we just talk about the core components
Sure.
that make up a hybrid framework?
Absolutely.
What are the key pieces here?
Yeah. So let's talk about the building blocks of a hybrid framework.
Yeah, building blocks. So what are we talking about here? Like, what are the pieces?
Yeah. So think about it like building a house.
Okay.
You have your foundation, the walls, roof, all that.
Yeah.
Each part has like a super important role in the whole structure.
Okay.
And it's the same with a hybrid framework.
Okay.
There are all these different components that work together.
Got it. Okay. So walk me through what are those components?
Sure. So let's start with test scripts.
All right.
They're basically like the instructions for the framework telling it what to test.
Okay.
It's where you define the steps for each test case.
So going back to that house analogy,
Mm-hmm.
are the test scripts like the blueprints then?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Okay.
Then you have reusable functions.
Okay.
Those are kind of like pre-made building blocks that you can use again and again.
Yeah, okay.
And they do specific tasks like, clicking a button or entering text.
So instead of writing the same code every single time,
Exactly.
you can just call one of these functions.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
And then we have this thing called keyword management,
Okay.
which is basically giving human readable names to those reusable functions.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes your test scripts way easier to understand.
Yeah.
Even if you're not super technical,
Right. So instead of seeing just like a jumble of code,
Yeah,
it actually says something like, log in or search for product.
exactly. And then you need the actual data to work with, right?
Right. Like usernames and passwords and stuff.
Exactly. So you have this thing called a data source.
Okay.
And that's where all that info lives.
Okay.
Could be like a spreadsheet or a CSV file or even a database.
So that's like our materials list for our construction project.
Perfect analogy.
We've got all the components, but now we actually need the stuff to build with.
Exactly. And then you need something to manage all of this.
Right.
And that's where the driver script comes in.
Right.
It's basically the conductor of your testing orchestra, reading the data, interpreting keywords, and calling the right functions.
So if the test scripts are the blueprints and the reusable functions are like the building blocks,
Yeah.
the driver script is like the general contractor, making sure everything actually happens.
Yeah, exactly. And then just like a construction project might have different phases or adjustments based on the environment, your framework also needs configuration files. Those store settings that might be different depending on the testing environment.
So it's like having different building codes based on where you're building the house.
Exactly. And then finally, you need a way to see the results of your work. And that's where the reporting mechanism comes in.
All right.
It generates these reports that show you like which tests passed, which ones failed, all that stuff.
So that's our final inspection report.
Yeah.
Letting us know if everything is up to code.
Exactly.
Okay. This is all starting to make sense.
Good.
But I got to say, hearing about all these pieces kind of makes it sound a little intimidating. To like actually build one of these things?
Yeah.
Where do you even begin with all this?
Yeah. So let's break down the implementation process step by step. And I think you'll see it's not as scary as it sounds.
All right. So we've talked about what hybrid frameworks are and like why you'd want to use them.
Yeah.
And we even kind of got a sneak peek at the different pieces involved.
Right.
Now, how about actually like building this thing?
Right.
What are the actual steps involved?
So, before we get to the steps, I think it's worth talking about some best practices.
Okay.
Just so you know, we avoid any like common pitfalls.
Yeah.
And make sure that your framework is, good and easy to maintain.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
What are some of the key things we should be thinking about?
So, one of the most important things is to centralize your configurations.
Okay.
So like instead of having all these settings scattered all over your code, keep them all in like one dedicated spot.
Yeah.
Like a properties file or a YAML file. That'll make it way easier to manage different testing environments.
So if I need to, switch from testing on my local machine to like a staging server, I don't have to go through and change like a ton of different settings all over the place.
Exactly. You just modify the configuration file.
Okay. That's super helpful.
Yep. And then another super important thing is modularity.
Okay.
So just like with any other kind of code, you want your framework to be, well structured and easy to maintain.
Right.
So break it down into distinct modules, each one with like a very specific purpose.
Okay.
And that'll make it much easier to, update and modify stuff later on.
Yeah. I can see how that would prevent things from getting all tangled up.
Exactly. And speaking of preventing messes, error handling is like super important.
Okay, right. What happens if a test fails because something goes wrong?
Right.
Like a web element isn't found or an API call doesn't work?
Exactly. You need to be able to handle those situations gracefully.
So instead of the whole thing just crashing, we can catch the errors, log them, and, maybe take a screenshot or something?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, now what about those keywords?
Right.
The human readable names for functions.
Yeah, so keep them simple and focused.
Okay.
Don't try to do too much with a single keyword.
Right.
Remember, clarity is key.
Right.
You want everyone to be able to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
Even if they're not, super technical.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Anything else we should be careful about?
Yeah, your test data.
Okay.
Make sure it's accurate and well structured.
Yeah.
And that it covers all the different scenarios you need to test.
So basically like garbage in, garbage out.
Exact.
Don't skimp on the quality of the data.
Right.
Okay. We've covered a lot. Any other like final words of wisdom?
Yeah, always think about scalability.
Okay.
So how is your framework going to handle, more and more test cases?
Right, as the application grows and changes.
Exactly. And can it handle different kinds of testing?
Okay.
Like performance testing or security testing.
So build it with the future in mind.
Right. Don't back yourself into a corner.
Yeah.
And one more thing, we talked about building a framework from scratch.
Right.
But there are tons of tools out there that can help.
Oh, okay. Like what?
So for data management, you could use like Apache POI for Excel files or OpenCSV for CSV data.
Yeah.
And then for running the tests, there's TestNG and JONUT. And for generating those reports, Extent Reports and Allure are both really good.
Wow, so many options.
Yeah, there's a lot out there.
This has been awesome.
Glad to hear it.
We went from, what a hybrid framework even is to like how to build one all the way to, specific tools we can use.
It's been great chatting with you.
Likewise. And hopefully everyone listening now feels like they can actually, build this thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you're out there listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
If you were to build a hybrid framework, what frameworks would you pick? And why? And what kind of challenges do you think you might face?
Good question.
Yeah. And until next time, keep on testing.